When I first started building AI voice agents, they were honestly pretty bad. Now, though, after dozens of projects I have done, I'm starting to realize there are small tweaks that we can do that would help improve both the performance and the reliability of the voice agents dramatically, and it also help make it feel and sound more natural to both clients as well as end users. So in this video, I'm going to share with you 10 techniques that will help take your voice agent from being average to incredible. I have learned and applied these hacks in many projects that I have built for clients from various different industries, from logistics to hospitality, real estate to IT firms. And this can be useful regardless of which platform you built on, whether it's retail, VAPI, Blend, or whichever setup you use, whether it's single prompt, multi-prompt, or even conversation flow. And for each of these hacks, I will explain to you why it works and how it works specifically in a real-life example. Ready? Let's get into it. So the first technique that I will talk about might surprise you a little bit because it actually has nothing to do with prompting or the actual voice agent itself. But if there is one thing that I want you to take away from this video, this is it. Before you even write a single line of prompt, create a flow diagram first. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's an example of an actual flow diagram that I built for a client, and as you can see here, I'm mapping out all of the different conversation paths as well as any single step on that path and all the different outcomes that can happen. So I'm mapping out all of the things that the agent should say, I'm mapping out all of the actions that it should take, the function calls, the APIs that it should call, and I'm mapping out all the different responses that we can get based on the outcome of that action and how the voice agent should handle that, either via a conversation or another action after that, right? So mapping out all of the different scenarios like this, not just in terms of the logical branches, but in terms of the possible objections that the user can raise, any edge cases that you should be aware of, and any potential errors that can happen, especially with APIs, right? And I will talk about this a little bit more later in the video. So why is it so important to do this? Well, creating a flow diagram, from my experience, really helps us establish a clear, logical, and coherent structure to the conversation. And it can also help us identify all the edge cases and errors that can happen during the conversation so that we can handle that during the development. I also find this to be a great way to align the project scope and expectations with the client, since with this flow diagram, they can also clearly see how the conversation would go and point out any misalignments or misunderstandings that we might have early on in the project, perhaps even before the project began, right? And this will be especially useful if you are building with a conversation flow, since this is basically the conversation flow already. This is basically half the work that you would have to do. So now, after having this diagram, all you have to do is to convert this flow diagram into the specific platform's conversation flow components, whether if it's retail, VAPI, Blend, voice flow, and so on. It doesn't matter. I do this for every single client project now, and it is the task that has the biggest ROI that I can do for the project. Do this right, and the rest of the building experience should be really straightforward execution. Okay, next we are going to get into the prompting techniques. So the first technique that I want to mention is to emphasize the agent's objective throughout the prompt, right? So how does it work, right? We basically remind the agent of the conversation's main objective. So a piece of instruction that I usually include in the note section of the prompt is this, right? Keep the responses focused on the objective of the agent, which in this particular case might be appointment booking. And remember that your primary objective is to get the customer to book a call with the sales rep. So how does this help? This really keep the agent more focused on the objective at hand and prevent them from talking too much. One of the main drawbacks of LLM is their tendency to hallucinate, or their tendency to keep babbling, going on and on and on about the different topics of the conversation. And even in the cases where the information that they are providing are correct, that comes straight from the knowledge base, it might not be how we want the conversation to go, because in this case, for the types of conversation that is really conversion focused, like appointment booking, we want the voice agent to be straight to the point, to drive the conversation, to direct it into the outcome that we want, which in this case is booking an appointment with the sales rep, right? So when we include this type of instruction along with examples of how to do it in the prompt, the voice agent will try its best to guide the conversation to this outcome. So for example, after answering a few questions that the users have, it will end with, do you want to discuss this in more detail with one of our sales reps? Right? And that's what we want. So you can see here in the prompt, this is the instructions that I showed you guys earlier. And then in the examples itself, I also include an example of how the voice agent should guide the user to that outcome, right? So I find the combination of examples and notes down here is really great to keep the agent focused on the task at hand, on the outcome that we wanted to achieve. The second technique that I want to discuss is leveraging dynamic variables, specifically retrieving and injecting the user's information from the CRM into the conversation whenever possible, either using a webhook for an inbound call or API for an outbound call, right? So why is it important? Well, first thing, is going to help make the conversation much more personalized. So instead of just saying a generic hello, we can say, hello Nathan, welcome back, how can I help you? Right? So that's definitely more personalized. And then the second and probably more important point is that it actually makes data collection much more streamlined and less error prone. So an example that I have here is again regarding appointment booking. So usually to book an appointment, we would need to ask the user for their email and then confirm by spelling it back to them to make absolutely sure that we get the information right. And that is not always easy, right? Due to background noise and due to potential transcription error. And one way to go around that, one way to work around that, if possible, is that we actually try to get the user's contact information, including email, into the conversation context, into the prompt itself, so that when it comes time for us to use the email address, like in this case to book an appointment, instead of having to ask for it, we simply confirm it with the user since we already have the information. So for example, in this case, an instruction that I have for the agent is, instead of asking the user for the email, we use the email information that we already have using a dynamic variable. So this is the syntax for a dynamic variable. And we basically spell it back to them. So the conversation would go something like, okay Nathan, so the email that we have on file for you is hna6300@gmail.com. Is that correct? And the user simply needs to say yes or no. So it makes it a lot more streamlined and also less error prone, since we don't need the user to provide the email, but we simply ask them to confirm yes or no. And most of the time the information would be correct, since we are retrieving this information directly from the business CRM. And so the user would simply say yes and we move on. Whenever I work with a client or a stakeholder, first thing that I would ask them is, so for all of the information that we would need to do certain actions like booking appointment, we would need the email. So do we have the email in the CRM and can we retrieve that? And if the answer is yes, which in most cases it is, then we can set up the system so that when the call happens, we can retrieve and import that information, usually based on the user's phone number that we get at the time of the call, right? So there are two ways for us to do this, depending on whether the call is inbound or outbound. So let's talk about the simple case first, right? If the call is an outbound call, meaning that we would need to make the call via an API, then what we can do is that in the API, so I'm using retail as an example, but I'm sure other platforms will allow us to do similar things too. So in the API call to create a phone call, right, there is a field here called dynamic variables. So it basically allows us to add dynamic variables in key value pairs of string that would be injected directly into the retail prompt. So when we retrieve this information, we can use and reference these variables by using curly braces like this. So here, this example, retrieving the name of the user, their email, and their phone number, right, from the CRM in order to use it throughout the conversation, right? So that is for outbound, when we actually inject this information as part of the API call. But what about inbound, when the user calls in to the agent? How do we in real time look up the information using the phone number? So to achieve a similar effect for inbound calls, we would need to do a few extra steps. We would need to go into the webhook settings, and we would need to set the inbound call webhook URL to the address of the URL of the server where we can send the phone number and retrieve back the user's information. So in this case, I'm using make.com scenario as an example, and so here we are specifying the webhook URL of the make.com scenario. And so when the call happens, retail is going to send us the phone number of the user who is calling, and we can find that in the from number here, right? And we can use this information to basically retrieve the CRM. So if it's Google Sheets, a simple Google Sheets, for example, you simply have a search and then input the phone number as a search parameter. In most cases though, it's going to be an API, so we can set up the API call to send the information of the phone number as part of the request. And if the user exists as a record into CRM, then we should get back their personal information, and then we simply need to extract and send back whichever information that we care about that we would need to use as part of the conversation in a webhook response back to retail like this. And then once retail receive this information, we will have access to them and can use them as a dynamic variable, just like what we did with outbound. So we have the name, the email, and phone number, and we can feel free to reference this information in the conversation however we want. Okay, so if we can actually import users' information into the conversation context, then that's great, right? But there are instances where we still need to gather some information from the user, and some of those information can be vital to the next step. So for example, if the whole point of the agent is appointment booking and we need the right email in order to do that, but we got the email wrong, then no matter how natural the voice agent sounds, no matter how well the conversation seems to go, if we got that one piece of information wrong, it's a waste, right? Doesn't provide any value, right? And so it's very important for us to get certain information right, specifically names and contact information, right? So in that case, we should instruct the agent to spell out important information when it's uncertain. And this can be done either by the user or by the agent. So by the user, we can ask them to actually spell it out for us, or we can have the agent gather the information first and then spell it back to the user to confirm whether if it is correct or not, right? And the reason why this is important is because, again, transcription is not always reliable, not just because the technology is not perfect, but also there are a lot of cases where there can be background noises, or when the user speaks with a certain accent, right? It might be very difficult for the AI to recognize what is being said, right? And so spelling things out makes it much easier for the AI to capture the correct information. An example instruction that we can provide to the AI would be when collecting the user's name, for example, ask the user to spell it out for you letter by letter to confirm. And besides providing the instruction in the notes, in the example conversation that we provide itself, we can also instruct the agent on how to do this. So here, for example, right, we have your email address as pete123@gmail.com. Is that correct, right? So that's an example of instructing the AI on spelling out the email address of the user to confirm. One bonus tip that I have for you guys as well, especially in case of email address, is that I usually include this little instruction here that for common email domains like Gmail or Hotmail, instead of spelling it out letter by letter, say the whole domain in one word, right? So instead of spelling out Gmail as gmail.com, right? That's a bit redundant because it's a very common domain. It can just say at gmail.com, because the most important part that we need to confirm is the earlier part of the email address and not the domain part, right? The next technique that I want to talk about that is also related to potential transcription errors is to instruct the agent to guess and clarify in case a potential transcription errors happen, right? So I might include an instruction like this in the notes. So you operate in a call and the user text might contain transcription error. Do your best to guess and understand and ask for clarifying questions if needed. And this will be done by the agent based on the overall context, the overall objective of the call. So the reason why this instruction is important is because if we don't have this, then there is a chance that the AI can get really confused and doesn't know what to do when the transcription is wrong. And when it's confused, the AI might decide to end the call thinking they have the wrong person on the line or say unexpected things. So an example that I actually encountered recently in a client project that I have is that the AI is supposed to confirm whether they are talking to the right logistic company. In this case, Coway Transportation, right? Coway, right? But because there was some background noise, the transcription came back as COVID, right? As in the pandemic. And so the AI got really confused about that. And because of that, the AI keeps saying, oh, I'm not here to discuss any health or virus related issues. I'm here to discuss freight shipment only, right? And it got the person on the other line quite confused. And so by providing this type of instruction, we can help the AI to understand that it is operating, the LLM is operating in the context of a phone call, and try to handle any ambiguity, any potential errors that might arise based on that context that they are in a call. So an example that I can give here is imagine that the agent is an appointment setter agent for a travel related company, right? And they have destinations going to Kyoto, Jeju, Lijiang, and Hoi An, right? And so what if we pretend to say one of the destinations slightly off, right? So we can simulate that using the LLM testing here. Yes, I'm interested in, so let's say instead of saying Kyoto, I would say Kyoto, right? So let's say that the user doesn't say it too clearly, right? And you can see that the voice agent actually recognized that they meant Kyoto and respond directly to providing information about the Kyoto trips instead of being confused about, I don't know what you meant by Kyoto, can you elaborate on that, right? So I think this is a very handy way to handle transcription errors that can happen more often than you think. The next hack that you can employ to make the voice agent sound more natural is to instruct how we should say list items, how we should list out items when there are a lot of information that it needs to convey to the user based on the question, right? So there are a lot of cases where the agents need to say long list of items, and we need to make sure that it says that in a natural way. Instead of listing out very rigidly, okay, here are the options we have. 1, this option, this price. 2, this option, this price. And believe it or not, if we don't include any instructions to guide it, that's what's going to happen. And this can be applicable in a lot of cases. So in the example that I will show you guys, there are different travel destinations, and in each of those destinations there are different packages with different pricing, right? And so that's one example. And then the other example might be when they ask for an availability of certain kinds of products, and there are various types of products available with different specs, right? Then that's another example as well, where the AI can keep going on and on, listing out all the information that it has. And so we can resolve that in different ways, right? The two most common way that I usually do it is through summarization or multi-question breakdown. So summarization is basically instructing the AI to somehow summarize all that information in more digestible chunks to the user, and then depending on what they say next, provide more information then, right? And then in a similar manner, we can actually break down the user's query into multiple smaller questions, right? And so, for example, in this example that I'm showing you guys here, when the user asks about the price, list the packages first without the price. So instead of listing out all of the options in specific detail, we can tell them which options are available first, and then let them pick the option that they are interested in, and then telling them the price. So something like that in action would look like this. So starting the information again, yes, and yes, I'm interested in Kyoto. Okay. What is the price? So very open-ended. And then here, so you see that the agent is, instead of providing the price right away, it's providing me with the different package, the different options first, right? So group tours, private tours, luxury experience, what are you into? Then I will provide you the price. So private tours, right? That's what I'm interested in knowing the price for. Right, and then here, only then it will provide me the price for the specific package, the specific option that is relevant to me, which in this case it's private tours. So instead of providing everything up front, it breaks down the user query into smaller questions, and then handle each of those questions one by one in a very natural and human-like way. The next one, and this one might be controversial, although I think soon it will not be, is to let the user know that they are talking to an AI. So basically how it works is we instruct the agent to introduce themselves right off the bat as a digital assistant instead of pretending to be a human, right? So here in the notes here, introduce yourself as Nomadica's digital assistant and confirm the user's interest. And so this is important because of two reasons. The first reason is that it is actually a regulation in certain regions, for example, the United States, right? That you would need to disclose to the user that they are talking to an AI. And I imagine that a lot of other regions who might not have this requirement right now will soon, as the technology, as AI voice agents become more and more prevalent, right? So that's the first reason. That's the part that sort of forces us to do this, right? But I do think that there are other benefits as well in terms of the user experience. So knowing that they are talking to an AI, it actually helps set the right expectation for the user to go through with the conversation. And I have seen this a lot of time in the conversations that the voice agents that I deploy to for clients have with the users. So when the user knows that they are talking to an AI, there's a tendency for them to actually slow down, and the user would often even try to find a cadence with the AI to wait for it to finish speaking to avoid interrupting it, because they are not entirely sure how well the technology works at the moment, right? And that helps as well, since interruption handling is not always perfect at the moment. And despite a lot of people's and businesses fear that as soon as an user recognizes that they are talking to an AI, they will hang up right away. From my experience, the reception from users are actually not that bad. In reality, they are becoming more and more receptive and used to speaking to an AI, and as the technology becomes adopted more and more broadly, it will becomes the case even more. And if you think about it from the user standpoint as well, right? If it's an inbound voice agent, meaning that the user is calling into the business to achieve some task, they already have the strong intention to do something, and so they are more inclined to deal with whoever is on the other side of the line, whether a human or an AI, to accomplish the task that they want to do, right? And if it's outbound, not talking about cold calling because it's actually illegal in a lot of regions. For outbound calls right now, it is required that the business gets explicit consent from the user anyway before making the call to them. So the user already has some knowledge about the business, and therefore they are often more receptive to receiving the call from the business that they already interacted with. And yeah, because of all of those reasons, I often recommend to my clients that we should disclose to the user that they are talking to an AI. An alternative way of doing this is to do it more discreetly, meaning that the AI will only disclose that it's an AI when the user explicitly asks whether it's an AI. That's a potential workaround, that's a potential alternative to doing this as well. Next, and also very important, is actually instruct the agent to anticipate and handle objections that might come up in the call. What this means is that during the design phase of the voice agent, when we talk to the business to understand their needs and how the conversation need to go in order to achieve the business objective, right? We outline the different points in the conversation where the user might have objections. So for example, when it comes to outbound calls, when the agent calls the user might not be available to talk right away, right? And that's very common. The user would say something like, oh, I'm busy right now, can you call me back in 10 minutes, in 2 hours, or tomorrow, right? That's a very common objection that we as AI voice agent developer, we need to work with the business to understand that objection, the common objections that can happen, and handle that, right? So in this case, for example, we can ask the user if it's now a good time to discuss, and if they say yes, then continue. If they say no, then actually ask them for an ideal time to call back, and then call a function, in this case, for example, to schedule a callback. And so this is a very common objection that I have seen in projects. There are many other ones. So for example, if it's a sales or lead qualification related use case, if the user says something which expresses that they think the price is too high, perhaps we can offer them some kind of discounts, or telling them some kind of payment plans, so that they know there are ways for us to resolve this issue, right? And it's very important for us to understand what the different common objections are, and as a business, how should we handle those objections in the call and instruct the AI agent to do so. And doing this would really increase the likelihood of the conversation actually achieving its objective, despite the various objections that can happen during the call. This is a quick one, but it actually can make a huge difference in keeping the user on the line and engaged, right? So besides the prompt, function calls are also a very big part of any AI voice agent, and sometimes functions can take a while to complete because oftentimes we are calling to an external API, an external service, and there's no way for us to guarantee that it's going to be completed quickly, especially for more complicated requests, right? And so in cases like that, we should instruct the agent to say things like, one moment, or let me pull this up, to keep the user patient, right? To let them know that we are still processing their request, which will make them more forgiving while waiting for the functions to complete. And initially, we would need to do this via some sort of prompting, but actually, some platforms like Retail AI provide us with the option to allow the agent to speak during the execution when it takes over 2 seconds, right? Then we can actually specify what message we want the agent to say to keep the user waiting, right? So there's this setting here, and I can quickly show you guys where that is. So when you set up a function, right, you set up a custom function, yeah, there's an option for you to let the agent speak during the execution of the function, and you can specify the message that you want them to say here, like, let me pull this up, or 1 second please. Also related to functions calling, the last technique that I want to share with you guys is to handle all the possible function inputs and outputs, and specifically in case of outputs, make sure to handle all the edge cases and errors that can happen, right? So it's really important when we call a function, when we call an API, to understand the specific possible inputs that it can accept and all the possible outputs that it can return. We need to really research and understand all the possible inputs and outputs and handle all of those cases accordingly in both the integration and the voice agent setup in the prompt, right? So why is it so important to identify and handle all of the possible cases that can happen during a conversation? Well, important part of being an AI agent is being autonomous, right? And so it means the AI will need to handle all of the processing and all of the decisions making during the call without any human supervision, right? And so we need to make sure that we provide the agent with all the context and all the instructions it needs in order to handle those cases. Not the successful case, it's not the expected case, but more edge cases and errors. This will help make sure that the system remains resilient at all times, regardless of what happens during the conversation, because we already have a plan B. We already have different solutions to all of the problems that might arise. So here's a simple example, and I'm using Make.com, but the same principle applies whether you use a different integration platform like n8n, or if you somehow call the API directly from retail. So if you remember earlier, we have a scenario that received the phone number information from retail and then try to look up in order to retrieve the user's information like the email and phone number, and then return it to the agent's context so that we can use that as dynamic variables in the conversation, right? And the happy case would be that, okay, we send the information and then we got back one record for that particular user. But what if there are somehow multiple people associated with this phone number? So a very realistic example of this might be if the voice agent works for a clinic, and in that case the parent's phone number can be used for both the parents themselves and the children. And so in that case, after calling the API, we can get back multiple records. So in this case, for example, we get back 2 people, right? And not just one that is associated with this number. And so in that case, we cannot just simply return 1, right? But we need to do some processing in order to aggregate and return all of the users that are found after the API call. And this is a very specific example of what can happen, but you get the idea. Each API call that we are going to make, we need to make sure that we understand all the possible outcomes that can happen, and we need to handle each of those outcomes accordingly, both in the integration setup, like what I'm doing here, what I'm showing here, and also in the voice agent setup in the prompt as well. So for example, if we know that after calling this function, we can get back 1 record, and we can also get back multiple records, then we need to prompt the agent to how to handle both of those cases, right? So that's example number 1 in terms of edge cases. The second example is regarding an error. So if we do not do anything and this API call results in an error, and it can be system timeout, it can be the servers going down, it can be some authentication issue, right? Then this scenario will simply fail, will simply error out. You will get an error email, but more importantly, the agent will not get any response. And if we don't handle that correctly, then the agent will just get stuck there, right? So what can we do in those scenarios? And so in Make.com, there is a quite simple way to catch and handle all the errors that can happen. I'm already doing this here, but let me just delete this for now and show you guys how it's done, right? So for a node, for a module that is calling an external service, in this case an HTTP node, but it can also apply to other module as well, that calls an external service like Google Sheets, right? So what you can do in make.com is that you can right click, add an error handler, right? And then here it will give you different options on how to handle different errors, right? So in this case, I'm not going to go through all this, but the simplest thing that you can do is to add a webhook response to return this error back to the voice agent so that it can handle that, right? And so we can do user not found in this case, and then we can return the error message, right? So in terms of make.com, this will allow us to handle different errors. It will allow the automation to not just stop, and the voice agent will get a response with the message as well as the error detail of what exactly happened. And so after the voice agent gets this error, then we can define how we should handle this error. And it really depends on what the error is. Some errors we can instruct the agent to deal with themselves if they are not too critical, right? In most other cases, if the errors are critical enough to actually stop the flow from functioning as expected, then the safest bet is just to transfer to a human agent, right? But without explicitly handling and defining how the system handles errors, then the voice agent will just be stuck there instead of handling it in a graceful manner. And yeah, those are 10 hacks, 10 techniques that I often use in client projects to make sure that the voice agent that I built remain reliable and natural sounding. I hope that was helpful, and I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section about any other techniques, any other hacks that you guys help while you build your AI voice agents in order to make them the best that they can be. And that's it from me today. I will see you guys in the next one. Stay curious. Bye.